My credit card didn't just decline that morning. It exposed a betrayal so deep that by the end of the month, my sister was sipping cocktails on a beach, and my parents were standing on a sidewalk, watching movers carry their furniture out of the only home they had left. I'm Aloan Pierce, 29 years old, senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in downtown Chicago. I've always been the predictable one. The daughter who color-codes her calendar, pays bills before they're due, and keeps an emergency fund that could outlive a recession. Stability isn't just a habit for me. It's identity. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Coffee. Laptop open. Banking app check before heading to work. I believe in reviewing accounts daily. It's part of how I stay in control. But the second my eyes scanned the screen, something felt wrong. Pending transaction. $12,700. Merchant. Azure Horizon Luxury Travel. For a moment, I assumed it was fraud, some random breach, some data leak. But the merchant name wasn't random. It rang a bell immediately. I'd heard it repeated over dinner tables for weeks. My younger sister, Maricela Pierce, had been obsessing over a dream escape she said she deserved after everything she'd been through. White sand. Private villas. Clear blue water. She'd said the travel agency specialized in high-end, curated experiences. My pulse began to thud in my ears. I hadn't booked anything. I hadn't authorized anything. And I definitely hadn't spent $12,700 overnight. My hands felt cold as I tapped into the transaction details. It wasn't a recurring subscription or a small test charge. It was a full booking, processed manually with the complete card number, expiration date, and security code. That meant whoever used it had access to all of it. Not hacked. Not guessed. Entered. I called my bank immediately, voice steady but tight. The representative confirmed the authorization had gone through cleanly, no suspicious flags. The billing address matched. The IP location? Residential. Suburban. My parents' neighborhood. A memory hit me so clearly it made my stomach twist. Months ago, my mom had asked for my card details to order groceries when her debit card was acting up. I hadn't thought twice. I texted her a photo of the front and back, trusting she'd delete it after. I ended the call with the bank and just sat there in silence. $12,700 isn't a typo. It's not casual. It's not accidental. It's deliberate. And the worst part wasn't the money. It was knowing this didn't feel like a stranger's crime. It felt like family that I didn't go to work that morning. Instead, I grabbed my keys, my phone charger, and the folder I keep in my car with important documents, insurance, bank summaries, property paperwork. My hands were steady, but there was a pressure building in my chest that made every breath feel shallow. My parents' house was a 40-minute drive from my apartment. The same brick colonial I grew up in. The same house I had refinanced 3 years ago when foreclosure notices started arriving in bright orange envelopes. The same house that legally belonged to me. When I pulled into the driveway, my father's truck was there. So was my mother's SUV. Maricela's car was gone. That detail didn't escape me. I walked in without knocking. I still had my key. My mother, Lynette Pierce, was at the kitchen island scrolling through her tablet. She looked up, surprised but smiling at first. Aloan? You're not at work. My father, Gideon Pierce, sat at the dining table reading the paper. He lowered it slowly when he saw my face. I need to ask something, I said, keeping my voice level. Did either of you use my credit card this week? The air shifted instantly. My mother's smile faded. Not dramatically, just enough. My father folded the newspaper too neatly, buying time. No, my mother said quickly. Why would we? I placed my phone on the counter and slid it toward them. The screen showed the pending charge. $12,700. Merchant name bold. Silence. My father cleared his throat. That's a lot. Yes, I replied evenly. It is. A second later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Maricela appeared, phone in hand, still in pajama shorts and an oversized sweatshirt. She froze when she saw all of us gathered. What's going on? She asked, though her eyes had already dropped to the phone screen. I watched her face carefully. Shock flickered there, but not confusion. Recognition. Maricela. I said quietly. Did you book a trip? Her jaw tightened. It's not what you think. My mother turned toward her sharply. Marie. But it was too late. Yes, she snapped, defensive now. I did. I needed a break, okay? I've been stressed. And I was going to tell you. By charging my card without asking? I asked. She crossed her arms. I was going to pay you back. When? She hesitated. After I get back. Her. You mean after you take the trip? It's non-refundable, she shot back. You don't understand how these packages work. My mother stepped in, voice soft but firm. Eloan, honey. She deserves something beautiful for once. She's had such a hard year. I felt something inside me go still. So the solution, I said slowly, was to steal $12,700 from me? My father finally spoke. Don't use that word. What word? I asked. Steal. I let out a short breath. If anyone else had done this, that's exactly what you'd call it. Maricella's eyes flashed. You make 6 figures. It's not like this ruins you. That sentence landed harder than the charge. It wasn't just about money to her. It was about entitlement. You didn't even ask, I said. You would have said no, she replied instantly. There it was. The logic. My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. We're family, she said gently. We don't go nuclear over things like this. My father added, we'll figure it out. But no one said I'm sorry. No one said we were wrong. They looked at me the way they always had when finances came up. Not as a daughter. As a solution. And standing there in that kitchen. The house I had saved, the mortgage I paid, the roof I legally owned, I realized. Uncomfortably. We were going to repay that. It's been 11 months. My mother's voice hardened slightly. Why are you listing everything like we owe you? Because you do, I thought. Instead, I said, because I'm tired of pretending this is normal. Maricela scoffed. You like being the hero. Don't act like you hate it. That accusation cut deeper than she knew. I didn't like being the hero. I liked being safe. I liked knowing the house wouldn't be taken. That lights would stay on. That no one would have to panic. But somehow stability had turned into obligation. You took my card. I said slowly. You didn't ask. You didn't warn me. You just assumed I'd absorb it. It's just money, she replied. No, it wasn't just money. It was months of careful budgeting. It was delayed travel for myself. It was the promotion I postponed because I needed to stay local to manage their finances. It was every practical choice I'd made while she chased experiences. And now she was flying first class to an island resort with funds she hadn't earned. I want it canceled, I said firmly. Today. Maricela's expression changed. Panic flickered there. I can't. It's non-refundable. Then you'll take out a personal loan and pay me back immediately. My mother gasped. Eloan, that's extreme. No. Iraplia calmly. Extreme is charging someone $12,000 without consent. My father stood up from the table. Enough. Family doesn't threaten each other over money. I looked at him, really looked at him. Family also doesn't treat one daughter like an ATM. And for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar rising above guilt and responsibility. Resentment. Cold, clear, and justified. I didn't argue further that afternoon. There's a moment when you realize you're not being heard. You're being managed. Every word I said was reframed. Every boundary I drew was labeled dramatic. So instead of continuing the circular conversation, I shifted tactics. Fine, I said quietly. If you're confident this will be handled, then show me how. They mistook that for surrender. I went home and opened my laptop. If I was going to dispute the charge formally, I needed documentation. I downloaded transaction logs, pulled my credit reports, and reviewed every account tied to my name. That's when something else caught my attention. Utility notifications tied to the house. A gas account update request. A water service inquiry. Both initiated within the last 2 weeks. Under my parents' names. That didn't make sense. All utilities were intentionally kept under my ownership to maintain legal clarity. I logged into the property portal and checked county records, just to be thorough. Everything was still in my name. But then I found it. An email buried in my inbox from a local attorney's office. A consultation request confirmation. The subject line referenced tenant rights inquiry. I never booked that consultation. But the phone number listed? It was my father's. I sat back slowly. Tenant rights. They weren't just assuming I'd absorb the credit card charge. They were preparing for the possibility that I wouldn't. Preparing legal positioning. Establishing documentation. Creating a narrative where they were residents with claim protections. Just in case I turned against them. This wasn't panic spending by a reckless sister. This was contingency planning. I called the attorney's office directly and identified myself as the property owner. The receptionist confirmed that Gideon Pierce had inquired about long-term residency protections and eviction timelines, if ownership changed behavior. If ownership changed behavior. That phrasing was deliberate. My father hadn't defended Maricela out of blind emotion. He had already anticipated conflict. They knew using my card was wrong. And instead of asking forgiveness, they researched how to protect themselves from consequences. The realization didn't make me cry. It made me very, very calm. I opened the mortgage amortization schedule next. I calculated current equity based on recent neighborhood sales. The market had risen sharply over the last 18 months. If I sold now, I'd walk away with significant profit, even after fees and closing costs. Enough to erase the $12,700 without blinking. Enough to reset my life entirely. I stared at the spreadsheet. For years, I'd believed keeping the house was loyalty, stability, responsibility. But legally and financially it was an asset. And assets can be liquidated. The deeper betrayal wasn't the money. It was the assumption that I would never enforce ownership. That I would always choose guilt over leverage. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. They had prepared for me to fight. They hadn't prepared for me to disengage. And that distinction would change everything. That I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset, but because I was calculating. For years, every major decision I made factored them in. Job offers were weighed against proximity to the house. Investments were chosen based on liquidity in case they needed help. Even my savings goals were structured with a silent assumption. What if something goes wrong again? But this time, something had already gone wrong. And it wasn't financial. It was structural. By morning, the emotional fog had burned off. What remained was clarity. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and labeled it plainly, Decision Analysis. Column A, keep the house. Column B, sell the house. Under keep, I listed projected appreciation, ongoing mortgage payments, maintenance reserves, property taxes. Then I added a separate line item, family risk exposure. Because that's what it was. Not emotional strain. Risk exposure. Under sell, I listed current market value based on 3 comparable properties in the neighborhood. I subtracted closing costs. Estimated net gain. Capital gains implications. Even after conservative projections, I would walk away with enough profit to recover the $12,700 twice over. Eliminate remaining student loans. Fund a down payment on my own condo. Rebuild a fully liquid emergency reserve. For the first time since I was 26, I imagined a future that wasn't anchored to that house. No shared driveway. No silent expectations. No surprise expenses dressed up as emergencies. Just clean ownership. Clean separation. My phone buzzed mid-morning. A text from my mother. Let's not overreact. We'll talk tonight. I didn't respond. Instead, I searched local real estate agents. I didn't choose the flashy one with billboards. I chose the one with consistent reviews describing her as efficient and discreet. Her name was Camden Rhodes. I called and introduced myself as the sole legal owner of a 4-bedroom colonial in a high-demand suburban pocket. I asked for a same-week valuation. She didn't ask why I was selling. Professionals harelido. That afternoon, she walked through the house while my parents were out grocery shopping. I scheduled it intentionally during a time I knew they'd be gone. Camden took photos, measurements, notes about upgrades, most of which I had paid for. New roof. Updated HVAC. Kitchen remodel. All documented. Market's aggressive right now, she said, reviewing her tablet. If priced strategically, you'll have multiple offers in under 2 weeks. Under 2 weeks. The speed of it felt surreal. Can we list quietly? I asked. Minimal signage. Controlled showings. She nodded. Off-market interest first. Then full listing if needed. That night, I drafted a timeline backward from a potential 30-day close. I mapped out contingencies, utility transitions, legal notice periods required in Illinois, for owner-occupied tenancy without a formal lease. 30 days. That was all that was legally required. When my parents returned home, my mother called. We need to fix this before your sister leaves, she said, voice tense. She flies out in 10 days. 10 days. I looked at my calendar. If everything moved efficiently, we could be under contract before she even boarded the plane. I finally responded, keeping my tone neutral. There's nothing to fix. I'm evaluating my options. A pause. What does that mean? She asked. It means, I said evenly, that ownership comes with choices. She didn't like that answer. But for the first time, I wasn't speaking as the daughter who felt obligated. I was speaking as the legal owner. And once that shift happened inside me, there was no going back. By the end of that week, the listing was live, quietly but strategically. Camden kept her word. No oversized yard sign. No public spectacle. Just a targeted release to pre-qualified buyers and agents with clients actively searching in that zip code. The photos looked immaculate. Sunlight through the bay windows. The remodeled kitchen gleaming. The backyard staged like a magazine spread. It didn't look like my childhood home. It looked like inventory. The first showing request came within 12 hours. I coordinated everything around my parents' schedules. Maintenance inspections. I told my mother when she asked why someone needed access Thursday afternoon. Insurance review. I said on Saturday. Each time, she accepted the explanation without digging. That part almost hurt. The trust she gave me so easily. Unaware I was dismantling the structure beneath her. By day 6, 3 offers were on the table. One was aggressive, above asking, minimal contingencies, flexible close date. I accepted it. 30-day closing. No rent-back agreement. When I signed the contract electronically, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph. Relief. The house had always been framed as protection. But protection can become a cage if you're the only one reinforcing it. I had tied my adulthood to that mortgage, believing stability would eventually translate into mutual respect. Instead, it had translated into assumption. That night my sister called. I leave in 4 days, Maricela said, her voice bubbling with excitement. You should see the itinerary. Private seaplane transfer. Overwater Villa. This place is insane. I listened quietly. She wasn't calling to apologize. She wasn't calling to update me on repayment plans. She was calling to share details of a trip funded by my card. Have you figured out the bank thing? She asked casually. It's being handled, I replied. Good, she said. I knew you would. There it was again. Certainty. Not in herself. In me. After the call ended, I opened the escrow portal and reviewed the timeline. Inspection in 10 days. Appraisal scheduled. Utilities transfer pending confirmation. Everything was moving. Meanwhile, in that house, my parents moved through their routines, watering plants, watching television, planning meals, completely unaware that the foundation beneath them was no longer permanent. I wasn't hiding out of cruelty. I was waiting for completion. Because I knew something they didn't. Once paperwork finalizes, emotions don't reverse it. 3 days later, Maricela left for the Maldives. My mother sent a family group message with airport photos, smiling faces, luggage tagged, captions about living life to the fullest. I didn't respond. Instead, I confirmed the appraisal appointment. The house passed inspection with minor notes. The buyers were enthusiastic. Financing cleared faster than expected. Everything aligned. While my sister sipped champagne at 30,000 feet, I sat at my dining table reviewing closing disclosures. The numbers were final now. After payoff and fees, The net proceeds were substantial. More than enough to erase the charge. More than enough to reclaim my independence. And for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. They believed I would absorb the damage quietly. They never imagined I would remove the structure entirely. But in exactly 22 days, the keys would no longer represent obligation. They would represent exit point. 2 weeks passed in a blur of logistics and quiet calculation. I coordinated movers, scheduled utility transfers, and double-checked every contract clause. Camden handled most of the buyer communication. I kept my parents in the dark. Each phone call I fielded from them was careful, neutral. The inspector is coming tomorrow. The appraisal confirmed value. No mention of intent or emotion. I was calm, precise, like a professional managing property, not a daughter orchestrating a coup. Meanwhile, my parents continued their routines as if nothing was happening. My mother baked cookies in the kitchen. My father tinkered in the garage. Maricela was still halfway across the globe, blissfully unaware that the safety net she and my parents had counted on was disappearing day by day. Then the day came. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning. My parents were out for groceries. I let them in, supervised the process, and watched as everything, furniture, appliances, heirlooms, and trinkets, was loaded onto trucks bound for the new owners. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy. By noon, the house was nearly empty. The walls seemed hollow. The rooms I had grown up in, that I had painstakingly preserved through renovations and payments, were now just physical space waiting for strangers. When my parents returned, the movers were gone. I handed them an official 30-day notice. My mother froze. My father's jaw tightened. My hands were steady as I explained the details. You have 30 days to vacate, I said calmly. The house is sold. Ownership has changed. My mother's voice trembled. Aloan, this is extreme. Can't we work something out? No, I said. We had enough negotiations. My father tried to argue, but I reminded him, quietly and firmly, whose name was on the deed. Legal clarity didn't need moral debate. And then, for the first time in years, I felt the power of boundaries in motion. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't petty. I was enforcing consequence. For the first time, the betrayal, the $12,700, the disregard for my work and trust, met proportional response. And in the silence that followed, I realized that sometimes, the most effective revenge isn't confrontation. It's clarity. Ownership. Action. By the time Maricela returned from her trip, the reality hit hard. She stepped off the plane, sunburned and exhilarated, phone loaded with pictures of overwater villas and turquoise waters, ready to brag about her adventure. Her excitement evaporated the moment she opened the mailbox and found the notice of sale and confirmation of the house transfer. The equity she had treated as a safety net, the house she assumed would always cushion her mistakes, was gone. Just like that. Wait, what is this? She stammered, waving the documents. Aloan, you can't do this. This is insane. I met her gaze evenly. I already did. Her panic transformed into anger, then desperation. But, Mom and Dad, they didn't say you could. They didn't need to, I said. This has nothing to do with them. This is about respecting boundaries. About ownership. About consequences for choices you made. Her face flushed, a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. I didn't gloat. I didn't add insult to injury. I simply let her feel it. The sudden weight of reality she had never been prepared to face. Later, my parents called, voices shaking, trying to negotiate, plead, explain. Aloan, we never thought you'd. I handled this as responsibly as you mishandled my trust. I interrupted gently but firmly. This is a consequence of your choices, of your disregard for ownership, of your expectation that I'd always absorb the damage. I could hear the resentment, the shock, the disbelief in their voices. But there was no reversing it. The deed was signed. The keys were transferred. The equity liquidated. And as I hung up, I finally allowed myself to exhale. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. A lesson learned the hard way. I poured a cup of tea, sat by my window, and let the cityscape of Chicago fill my view. For the first time in years, I felt untethered. No hidden expectations. No silent obligations. They had taken my kindness for granted. They had assumed forgiveness and compliance would always come. And I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the strongest love you can give yourself is the one that enforces boundaries and allows betrayal to meet its natural consequence. The house was gone. The charge had been neutralized. And finally, I was freed. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath settled into a rhythm of clarity and quiet transformation. My parents had moved into a modest rental across town. The house they had once treated as permanent sanctuary, paid for, maintained, and legally mine, was now in the hands of strangers. They were forced to budget, to face reality, to navigate life without the assumption that I would always absorb their mistakes. Maricela tried to recover gracefully, but it was too late. No more luxury vacations funded on my credit. No more relying on my stability as a buffer for her irresponsibility. She had to find her own footing, get a job that could sustain her, and start managing her own finances for the first time in her adult life. For me, the lesson was deeper than money or revenge. It was about understanding that enabling doesn't create loyalty, it breeds expectation. Trust is earned, boundaries are respected, and consequences are inevitable when those lines are crossed. I used the proceeds from the house to secure my own condo, a place fully my own, where no one could leverage my generosity. I invested the rest, built a safety net, and gave. Resentment, the shock, the disbelief in their voices. But there was no reversing it. The deed was signed. The keys were transferred. The equity liquidated. And as I hung up, I finally allowed myself to exhale. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. A lesson learned the hard way. I poured a cup of tea, sat by my window, and let the cityscape of Chicago fill my view. For the first time in years, I felt untethered. No hidden expectations. No silent obligations. They had taken my kindness for granted. They had assumed forgiveness and compliance would always come. And I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the strongest love you can give yourself is the one that enforces boundaries and allows betrayal to meet its natural consequence. The house was gone. The charge had been neutralized. And finally, I was freed. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath settled into a rhythm of clarity and quiet transformation. My parents had moved into a modest rental across town. The house they had once treated as permanent sanctuary, paid for, maintained, and legally mine, was now in the hands of strangers. They were forced to budget, to face reality, to navigate life without the assumption that I would always absorb their mistakes. Maricela tried to recover gracefully, but it was too late. No more luxury vacations funded on my credit. No more relying on my stability as a buffer for her irresponsibility. She had to find her own footing, get a job that could sustain her, and start managing her own finances for the first time in her adult life. For me, the lesson was deeper than money or revenge. It was about understanding that enabling doesn't create loyalty, it breeds expectation. Trust is earned, boundaries are respected, and consequences are inevitable when those lines are crossed. I used the proceeds from the house to secure my own condo, a place fully my own, where no one could leverage my generosity. I invested the rest, built a safety net, and gave myself the space to breathe, think, and finally feel safe in my independence. The moral of the story settled firmly in my mind. Support without boundaries is self-betrayal. Family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by respect, accountability, and reciprocity. Sometimes, justice doesn't need confrontation or anger. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and absolute, like handing over the keys to a house that once belonged to those who never truly valued it. And as I walked through my new apartment, I realized something profoundly satisfying. The betrayal had met its natural consequence, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. Months later, life had begun to settle into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. My condo was fully furnished, a space of my own choosing, reflecting my tastes and priorities. No more living in a home where every corner carried the weight of unspoken expectations or financial obligations that weren't reciprocated. I could breathe, think, and make decisions for myself without fear of manipulation. Maricela had started her first steady job, a position that required responsibility and accountability. It was a slow process for her, but every paycheck was now earned, every decision her own. My parents, too, had adjusted, though grudgingly. They had to budget, to navigate life without relying on the stability I had provided for decades. I observed from a distance, detached but aware. This was their lesson unfolding in real time. I reflected often on the $12,700 charge that had set everything in motion. At first, it felt like a betrayal too large to absorb. But in hindsight, it had been a catalyst, a final spark that forced me to enforce boundaries, to reclaim what was legally and morally mine, and to redefine my relationship with family. The satisfaction wasn't in vengeance or malice. It was in justice served naturally. They had relied on me for too long, assuming compliance and forgiveness. When those assumptions were met with action, they had no choice but to face consequences they had never truly anticipated. I realized that true strength isn't about punishing others. It's about knowing your worth, taking control of your life, and letting natural consequences unfold. Betrayal, when handled with clarity and resolve, has its own way of correcting itself. For the first time in years, I felt unshackled. My financial independence was secure. My boundaries were respected. My emotional labor no longer taken for granted. And the knowledge that I had acted decisively, without cruelty, without impulsiveness, brought a calm, almost meditative satisfaction. Sometimes, karma doesn't require interference. Sometimes, it simply needs ownership, courage, and the willingness to let reality speak for itself. And in that truth, I found not just closure, but freedom. With time, even the tension in my family interactions began to fade, not because forgiveness had been given, but because circumstances had enforced change. My parents no longer called expecting assistance at a moment's notice. Maricela no longer assumed I would cover her mistakes. Every interaction was now tempered by reality, by the understanding that my generosity had limits, and that those limits had consequences. I often thought about that pivotal day, the moment I saw the $12,700 charge, and how it had ignited a chain of decisions that reshaped not only my life but theirs. What started as betrayal became clarity. What began as anger transformed into measured action. And in the quiet aftermath, I realized that sometimes the most profound revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public shaming. It's simply reclaiming what is yours and letting the natural consequences of choices unfold. I invested the proceeds from the house wisely, ensuring a secure future, and focused on building a life that wasn't tethered to others' irresponsibility. I traveled for myself, pursued projects I had delayed, and even started mentoring young professionals in financial literacy, sharing lessons learned the hard way. Maricela matured slowly, learning firsthand the value of earned rewards and personal responsibility. My parents, too, had to reconcile their expectations with the reality that my kindness wasn't infinite. They grew more self-reliant, and while the relationships remained complex, they became defined by respect rather than entitlement. The house sale, the charge, the confrontation, it all became a turning point, a story of betrayal transformed into empowerment. And every time I reflected on it, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from vengeance, but from the knowledge that I had reclaimed control, enforced boundaries, and allowed natural justice to take its course. Sometimes the strongest lessons come wrapped in betrayal, but with patience, clarity, and action, they can also become the foundation for freedom, resilience, and a life lived entirely on your own terms. By the end of the year, the dust had fully settled. I no longer felt the weight of unreciprocated responsibility pressing on me every day. My condo was not just a home. It was a symbol of independence, earned through clarity and decisive action. Every corner reflected my choices, not the obligations of others. Maricela had learned her lesson the hard way. She was now responsible for her own finances, her own trips, her own mistakes. The entitlement that had fueled the $12,700 charge had been replaced, slowly, by accountability. My parents had adjusted too, grudgingly, but the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the invisible safety net. I was a person with boundaries that demanded recognition. I often thought back to that morning when I first saw the charge. It had been a shock, yes, but it had also been the catalyst that allowed me to finally act, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The betrayal had forced me to recognize the limits of generosity, to define my own worth, and to let consequences follow naturally. The moral was clear: loyalty is not blind. Family is not entitlement. Boundaries are essential. And when betrayal occurs, justice doesn't always need to be dramatic. Sometimes it's simply the quiet exercise of ownership, responsibility, and self-respect. Looking back, I realized that the strongest form of revenge isn't humiliation or punishment. It's reclaiming your life, asserting your boundaries, and letting the natural consequences of others' actions play out. That realization brought me more satisfaction than any confrontation ever could. In the end, the $12,700 charge didn't just expose a betrayal. It revealed a truth I had long ignored: that protecting oneself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And in embracing that truth, I found not only justice, but freedom.
Some stories don't end, they follow you. If this one stayed in your mind, you know what to do.